Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our next panel, Preserving the Human-Animal Bond and Preventing Neglect by Facilitating Access to Care. My name is Megan Senatori, and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. It's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers. First, I'd like to welcome Linda Fielder. Linda is the Investigations Manager for the Criminal Justice Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. Linda has over 20 years of experience as an animal welfare specialist, 15 of which were spent at the Oregon Humane Society. As Director of Shelter Medicine and Humane Investigations there, Linda oversaw every aspect of animal cruelty cases, from the point that they were first reported through the victim animal's recovery and rehoming. Next, I'd like to welcome Ed Jamison. Ed became the CEO of Operation Kindness in March of 2021. With a history of providing life-saving care for homeless pets, Ed is leading Operation Kindness into a new chapter of growth. With the recently completed renovations and expansion of the OPK facility, the organization is ready to help even more pets in need. Ed is also currently the president of Texas Unites, vice president of the National Animal Care and Control Association, and board member for the Association of Animal Welfare Advancement and Shelter Animals Count. Finally, I'd like to introduce Emily Lewis. Emily is a senior staff attorney for the Criminal Justice Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. In that role, she oversees and triages case responses and works directly with law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and rescue groups, providing direction and support for all aspects of criminal animal cruelty investigation and prosecution. She supports frontline responders by training and consulting on search warrant drafting, evidence collection, and scene processing best practices. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll begin with the presentation by Emily and Linda. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session today. We are really excited to talk with you about this topic and honored to do so in this forum. Linda and I have been attending this conference for many years, and we know that we're in good company with our fellow presenters and our audience members who continue to be the force for positive change for animals across the country and also internationally. The theme of this year's conference is transforming our relationship with animals. And to pay homage to that theme, Linda and I thought that we would share our personal transformation in how we approached animal neglect investigations in our years in the investigations department at the Oregon Humane Society. Before we get into the details of the presentation, though, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the Animal Law Conference Planning Committee for this opportunity to speak with you today, and the Oregon Humane Society for the photos and case studies that are going to be referenced throughout today's presentation. A few disclaimers also to start off with. First, we try to avoid extremely graphic images, but there are some photos in this presentation that include depictions of animals who have medical conditions that need veterinary care, and just wanted to give you a heads up about those as they might be disturbing. And also, this is a general presentation that includes general information. None of it should be construed as legal advice. If you have a question about a case that you're directly involved with, I recommend that you consult a personal attorney. And with that, I will let Linda kick it off with laying the foundation of what was an important consideration in our journey in approaching animal neglect investigations.
Thank you, Emily. Animals were domesticated to help humans survive. When we think about the early domesticated animals, we know that they were trained or domesticated in order to help humans hunt, to guard their flocks, and to work their lands. But even in ancient times, humans kept dogs and cats particularly as solely companions. Historically, we think of companion animals as being a luxury enjoyed only by the wealthy, but that is not true. We see evidence of animal-human companion relationships within tribes and cultures with no currency or class associations. If we were in person, I'd ask how many of you have a companion animal or more than one at home that you consider your best friend and a family member. My companion animals have always been beside me through changes in my life, from moving across country, changing jobs, relationship breakdowns, loss of family members, my own health challenges, and now through a global pandemic. Whenever I'm having a bad day, all I want to do is come home and be with my animal and tell them about my day, or just sit quietly knowing that they're there to help and understand. While individuals and families experiencing poverty often live in a more fragile balance with regard to income, housing, employment, transportation, and so forth, pets provide that emotional support and unconditional love throughout these changes and hardships. When we think about what breaks the bonds between humans and their pets or their companion animals, we often look to animal shelters for statistics about the homeless animals that are coming into their doors every year. What we know is that through their work, keeping animals together with their humans is a much better outcome than adding to the population of already overcrowded shelters and humane societies. Currently, there are at least 19 million pets living in the United States, with families whose income level is below the poverty line, which is triple the number of dogs and cats who enter animal shelters every year. And there are millions more in working class, poor, and middle class families struggling with barriers to keeping their pets in the home.
And while companion animals do provide stability in uncertain times and comfort during distressful times, it's often the family companion animal who is the first whose care begins to slip when the individuals are faced with financial hardships. They may not be able to afford the quantity or quality of food that the animal needs, or due to housing insecurities, the animal has to be put on a chain outdoors and the shelter becomes a problem. Most people are aware of how poverty and structural inequality create barriers and challenges to healthcare and jobs and education, but there's less of awareness of how limited affordable veterinary care and access to pet wellness services create similar obstacles, and these challenges have criminal ramifications.
Emily and I worked together for many years at a humane law enforcement agency that investigated horrible cases of physical abuse, lack of care to animals, and even animal fighting and hoarding and puppy mills. But overwhelmingly, the majority of the cases that came across our desks had to do with chronic, untreated conditions or illnesses in the animals. And one of the types of cases that we saw over and over again were dogs, particularly with chronic dermatitis or bad skin. We associate this kind of a case with individuals who are unable to provide veterinary care, but starting with even minimum care to their animals in terms of the type of food that they feed. So many dogs are allergic to the top 3 ingredients in really low quality dog food, and that's corn, wheat, and soy. Those allergies can manifest in chronic skin infections that can turn systemic, hair loss, and just really uncomfortable, itchy conditions for the dog. Other allergies that are common in dogs and cats are allergies to the bite of a flea. And as we know, science has made great advances in terms of quality feed control for animals that works, but those products are expensive and sometimes out of reach for folks on limited income. So to kind of give an example of what a person might endure in trying to get a workup for a chronic skin condition, so a dog that has already suffered from this problem for a while, maybe has been turned into animal control or law enforcement, and the officer has asked them to take the animal to a vet. I kind of averaged costs around the country and came up with this number, but as you can see, it can total over $500 to get a generalized workup of the condition, plus medications, and then about $200 a month after that to try and maintain flea control, adequate food, and allergy medication. Another chronic condition that animals suffer from, especially over the age of 7, is chronic and serious dental disease. So when a cat or dog becomes older, if they haven't had regular routine dental cleanings, they can be faced with infection, gingivitis, and actually dental disease that progresses to the point where it makes it difficult for them to chew and swallow their food. Dentistry in the veterinary community has made huge advances over the past 10 to 15 years, and as a result of that, though, the cost of dentistry has gone up significantly. Again, I looked around the country to see what a cat or a dog with what I would call advanced dental disease, or the type of dental illness that would cause concern or maybe a report to animal control or law enforcement, and realized that that would be between $1,000 and $2,000 to address medically. When dogs and cats are not spayed and neutered as young adults or adults, a lot of problems arise. One is, of course, unwanted pregnancies and adding litters of puppies or kittens to a household that may already be struggling to pay to feed and care for adult pets in the home. A cat can have 3 to 4 litters of kittens in 1 year, and those mouths add up when it comes time to buy food and get vaccinations and take care of them and all their needs. As unaltered pets get older, we can see reproductive emergencies that arise, and the one that I chose for today's example is called pyometra, which is an infection of the uterus, and it can be, or always is, a medical emergency that requires immediate surgery and an emergency spay. When we look at emergency clinic visits for an animal or emergency procedures, we know that the price of those is out of reach for many. And the total that I came up with here was really kind of on the low end for what it might take to address an older female dog with an emergency pyometra. When we talk about companion animals, we don't want to leave out livestock. Many individuals and families own horses or donkeys or ponies, and they sometimes acquire these animals for free or little money without realizing how much they cost to properly maintain, feed, and care for. Average cost of keeping one horse is $280 to $325 a month, and that comes to about $3,800 a year. And that's not including the really important routine medical care that these horses need, and that includes regular teeth trimming and hoof care. Without those regular events happening for them, they can develop really painful lameness that impairs their ability to walk, or their teeth can become overgrown to the point where it's hard for them to chew and swallow their food, and that can lead to weight loss and starvation.
Keeping those costs in mind, we now turn to look at the various states' animal protection statutes. In 21 states, the statutes specifically require veterinary or medical care be provided to animals. And in 9 additional states, there's more vague language, such as maintaining the health or well-being of the animal or providing other essential care. All of these have been construed by courts to mean the provision of veterinary care. And when you look at these laws that enforcement agencies are mandated to uphold and think about them in the context of the statistics we heard earlier of people living at or below the poverty line with companion animals and the medical assessments that Linda just went over, you can see the potential for widespread problems with enforcement and compliance. And we did just want to clarify in this presentation, when we're talking about animal neglect laws, we're talking about what's known or can be referred to as passive animal cruelty, which is an inaction that results in the suffering or harm to an animal. And passive animal cruelty should not be conflated with a phrase known as benign neglect, which we have noticed that being used more frequently and feel that that's concerning because it implies that no harm will come to an animal. And neglect in the dictionary is defined as failing to care for properly, to provide little attention to, or to disregard. And there's no circumstance that I can think of where disregarding a condition or circumstances related to proper care of an animal would not result in harm, be it psychological or physiological. Benign is defined in the dictionary as having little to no detrimental effect, of no danger to life or harmless. And there are a number of factors that we assessed in investigations that we were a part of that when we're determining whether an animal is suffering a harm and or from a condition or from a circumstance, and it involves the expertise of veterinarians and behaviorists. So familiarizing a phrase like benign neglect is concerning because it doesn't have specific parameters around how that's defined, and it creates a dangerous gray area in the context of animal neglect investigations. But what if a law enforcement agency is mandated to uphold the animal protection laws in a state, and they come across a case where an animal is not being provided veterinary care in a state that specifically requires that? What happens then? Many times an officer will request that the person get veterinary treatment and follow all of the recommendations and diagnostic recommendations that the veterinarian made. And you saw previously how much those can cost, and they go upwards from there. If a person does not provide those or is not able to, then the ramifications of that could be a search warrant executed on their home, removal of their animal and other animals in the home, a criminal citation for neglect possibly. And if that occurs, then over usually a year and a half of proceedings related to that criminal action, and the costs associated with that and the fines and restitution that could be a part of the sentencing in that case if someone is convicted. Also, if someone is convicted, they can be sentenced to a possession ban in many states, which would be that they're not allowed to possess the victim animal or attain any additional animals for a certain period of time, usually several years after the conviction. And then that person has a criminal record going forward and all the implications of that. There are cases where that type of response from authorities is expected and a criminal citation would be appropriate. And I want to be very clear that those are not the types of cases that we're focusing on in our presentations today. Those types of cases, the malicious, intentional neglect, like this would be an example of this dog, the owner withheld food intentionally, in addition to exercising this dog hours every day by running him miles next to his car. That's intentional conduct and neglected this animal to the point of this body condition. Another situation that we aren't referring to in this presentation is knowingly committing neglect, knowing that your conduct of not providing this care is harming the animal, a willful component to that neglect. This is an example of that with this dog. The woman housed the dog in the yard and never provided any care to the dog. One day the dog collapsed and she brought him into the shelter and told employees that he just wasn't on her priority list. These are not the cases that motivated our transformation and thinking about these investigations, and they're not the focus of today's presentation. And I wanted to make a clear separation between these different kinds of neglect cases because there is a continuum of neglect cases. Every case is different. It has different sets of facts and components, and fortunately, those types of cases I just talked about are not the majority of cases that get reported in our experience. It's these cases on the bottom half of the pyramid here that are the focus of our presentations today and the impetus for our transformation in how we approached animal neglect cases. We did start out with a black and white approach or mindset to cases that the law required medical care or proper care, and it wasn't being provided to this animal who was suffering as a result, and therefore this criminal course of action should be followed. Very quickly, we learned what impaired people's ability to provide care to their animals. We saw those barriers and we saw the bond that people had with their animals. And we started thinking about what can we do to alleviate the animal's suffering, because we do have a duty there, but also preserve the bond and allow that animal to stay with the human that they have that strong connection with. And Linda's going to talk about one case in particular that was instrumental in changing our perspective.
Thank you, Emily. At the Humane Society, where our humane law enforcement agency was housed, we offered low-cost or no-cost euthanasia services to the public. When this little 15-year-old dog came in for euthanasia, it was obvious that she was experiencing end-of-life issues, but the staff in our admissions office also was concerned because the things that she had been suffering from seemed to have been chronic in nature and had gone untreated. This little dog had matted fur and had a mammary tumor on her abdomen because she was an unspayed female dog in her later years, and that tumor had ruptured and was oozing onto her abdomen. The admissions staff called our law enforcement agent to come down, and our investigator took a look at the dog. And as Emily said, we tend to have a black and white view of what failure to provide minimum care is and how that equates to criminal animal neglect. So we wrote up a case, and we intended to pay a visit to the owner of this dog to interview him about how his companion animal got to be in this condition. When our investigator got to the residence of this individual, he was actually outside walking his other dog, a 7-year-old Maltese mix. The man lived in an RV on a very limited fixed income and only had his dogs for his companions. He explained to our investigator that he considered his dogs to be family. He did everything he could for them. Even on his fixed income, he managed to get his dogs groomed every other month and kept their coats clean. He explained that he didn't have any family or friends and that his pets were that to him. The man invited our investigator inside his RV, and he was proud and happy to show him around at the way he had arranged his belongings and his furnishings to make things as comfortable as possible for his dogs. His little Maltese mix jumped up on a chair that had multiple clean blankets and was next to a space heater, and the man explained that this is where this dog liked to sleep. Then he got emotional, and he went to the area where his now deceased dog, who he had had its entire life, liked to lay. This little dog's favorite place had been the passenger seat of this RV, and he showed our investigator how he put blankets down, and he explained that a month ago, a tumor that had been growing on his dog's abdomen had ruptured, and he explained how he kept that clean and how he washed it, and how because of the dog's declining condition, he hadn't taken her in to be groomed for some time because he didn't want her to be scared or grumpy or feel uncomfortable. What we realized was missing here was not this man's commitment to or care for his animals. What we realized was missing was access to some type of services that would have made the care needed to spay his dog early or to help with a low-cost veterinary visit that could diagnose the dog's tumor and provide comfort and pain control to the dog in its final days, and then access to a low-cost euthanasia and help with that decision when the time had come. Our investigator got emotional while he was interviewing this man, and the owner also was visibly shaken and devastated by the loss of one of his best friends. He didn't have access to the internet. He didn't even have a cell phone, and he didn't know who to call, and he was frightened when he saw that his dog's condition was declining. And he explained to our investigator that the moment he realized she was having more bad days than good, he found a way to get her into the Humane Society for Euthanasia. If this man had been cited or convicted of animal neglect, he would have faced a 5-year possession ban, and his other pet dog would have been taken from him. He wouldn't have allowed to have any other animal companions for up to 5 years. Our investigator realized that this wasn't the answer for this man or his existing animal, and understood that access to services was what he needed. So he gave him his card, and he explained to him that if his dog that he has now ever became sick or injured, that he should call, and he would be made aware of what services were available to him. We saw a lot of cases like this, and over time, these were what changed our mind about what makes a pet owner worthy, so to speak, of having an animal, and start to rethink what a community can do, what organizations can do to reach out and provide help when needed. And I'm going to pass it over to Ed Jamison now from Operation Kindness, and he can share some of his experiences with you all.
Hello everybody, I am Ed Jamison. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. So I'm currently the CEO for Operation Kindness, a nonprofit shelter just north of the city of Dallas, and we're 5,000 to 6,000 animals come into our care. I have around 20 years of experience in the animal welfare industry. I'm currently the president of Texas Unites for Animals, the vice president for the National Animal Care and Control Association, and I'm a board member for Shelters Animal Count, as well as the Association of Animal Welfare Advancement. Most of what I'm going to draw on from today is going to be from my time as the director for Dallas Animal Services, but prior to that I was the chief animal control officer for the city of Cleveland. Dallas is a great case study when you're talking about access to care, preserving the human-animal bond, and what can happen when there is a lack of access to care for pets, on how some things can progress or be perceived to progress simply because of the access for care. To get a little bit of a grasp on the city of Dallas and just the size and scope, the red on the map is the city of Dallas, the red to the right is a lake, so that's not Dallas proper. But it's over 385 square miles. It's got 1.3 million population, human population. A median household income of $52,000. The national average there, it's about $10,000 more per household. 1 out of every 4.6 residents of the city of Dallas live in poverty. And the Dallas poverty rate is, it fluctuates a bit, but it's anywhere between 18.9 and 20%. And that's up from the national average of 10.5%. As I said, we're going to speak about some of my time at Dallas Animal Services, and I just left there about five or 6 months ago. But huge intake, and we're going to use 2019 numbers because obviously with the pandemic, everything is a bit off as far as animal data. But we had an intake of nearly 40,000 dogs and cats in our fiscal year 2019. The number of service requests that my officers responded to was almost 79,000, and calls that fell under the category that we have classified as lack of care was about 10,000. And for reference, when we get to this next slide that shows a map, which is really going to bring this home for everybody, about 70% of everything that we do in the city of Dallas is south of Interstate 30. So this line, yellow line that's on the middle of this map, that's where Interstate 30 cuts the city of Dallas in half. And I think that this really brings things home when you do a simple Google search of animal clinics in Dallas. The access is to the north, where more wealth is, and just simple access to things having to do with animals. When you look to the south, there is one clinic. For perspective, the landmass south of that yellow line is larger than the entire city of Atlanta and has a population larger than the city of Atlanta. That's all just considered southern Dallas, and that is where the huge lack of access. When you take 40,000 animals impounded, that's nearly 27,000 animals were located in Dallas proper south of that line. So I think that this really goes to show that it doesn't mean that people don't like animals. They obviously do because they have them there. That volume was coming in a year's period. But when you talk about the access to care, the SPCA of Texas is the only clinic that is south of that line. So I think it's pretty easy for people to get judgmental, and even when you're in an enforcement capacity, you have to look deeper into the situation to see if we're able to get resources delivered to that population, what does that actually do? Will people utilize that resource, and can that improve the life of those animals, thus helping to keep that bond and taking out things such as seizure and court cases may not even have to become part of the mix. I think that this is really telling. The next map here, this is for pet stores in the city of Dallas, and it's almost identical as far as the areas that have access to get things for their pets compared to south of Interstate 30. Again, you got 750,000 human population below that line, and not a single pet store comes up on that on your search. So when you get to dealing with trying to keep pets with animals, I think that COVID has obviously been extremely hard because human to human interactions become much more difficult. But that's what the ultimate goal has to be, is what are you able to do to get the services to the people that need to utilize those services. And so we're seeing a lot more mobile efforts from the different organizations in Dallas proper. But anytime that they're focusing their time in the north, I think that they're missing huge opportunities to get to the people that need them most. Again, over 27,000 animals came from south of that line just in 2019 alone. So I'm really anxious to get into the roundtable discussions where we can, bounce questions back and forth. But I think that Dallas is a great case study because of its size and showing a true divide from those that have that access to the different things that their animals need compared to those that don't. And even when our talk's all done, I'm very happy to have conversations with anybody who might have some questions. And so my information is right here. Okay, we'll talk to everybody soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. So, is enjoying a companion animal a right reserved for the wealthy or for individuals who have good credit or maintain a rainy day fund in case of emergencies? I would say absolutely not. And the way that we've identified the bond and the need to preserve the bond through education and access to resources, rethinking the role of first responders as educators and community caretakers can take us into a world where that's not necessary. We want to introduce some concepts that we think of as barriers to access to veterinary care. One word that we hear when we think about low-income demographics is service deserts. And we've heard about how families in marginalized neighborhoods may not have access to fresh, healthy, organic food. The same is true for access to veterinary clinics within a distance that they can get to by walking or through public transportation. When we think about getting to a vet clinic through public transportation, I think all of us know that it's common for buses and other modes of transportation, such as trains, to not allow animals other than service animals to ride. So that can be an increased barrier to getting an animal to a veterinarian if there isn't one within walking distance. When we think about capacity for care, then we look back to the families and the individuals who are going through hardships, whether it's struggles with mental health or physical health or loss of income or fixed income. There are definitely barriers in the home that can make it difficult for individuals to provide care to their animals. Inefficient practices for sure are an issue when we think about the struggles that many individuals are faced with in terms of transportation, mental health, and just what it's like to navigate the world when you're in a marginalized demographic. Emily talked about one-time, wrong-time emergencies, such as losing the car because it broke down or they had a wreck. A personal health emergency that's taken up all of the expendable income, or an emergency with a pet, such as being hit by a car or becoming suddenly ill. And we're going to talk in a little bit about the gold standard of veterinary care that's developed over years, which is we're thankful for these extreme advances in the veterinary care of our animals, but we realize that some of these advances have made practical vet care or low-cost vet care out of reach for some individuals. So what can communities do to kind of bridge the gap and make animal care and ownership within reach for everyone? I like to think of a community approach as the first place to start. And we're hearing about the budget cuts and reforms that are happening in law enforcement, and we know that that will trickle down to enforcement of animal crimes. So we think about ways that the community can fill in as caretakers and even first responders for animal cases. We think about community programs such as food banks that offer individuals in low-income demographics with food and supplies, and how by adding pet food and pet supplies to their stores, they could help countless animals. We know that low-cost or subsidized veterinary clinics are cropping up in association with nonprofit organizations or animal shelters and humane societies around the country, and that's a great way to make veterinary care accessible to everyone. Even non-animal organizations such as human services, senior citizen centers can all be first responders or that initial line of sight to keep an eye out for animals that may need help and individuals who may need help caring for them.
We're now going to talk about two case studies that exemplify how the community can play a role and how a different approach to animal neglect cases can really make a difference and be the moral way to go about handling those types of cases, both for the animal and for the humans involved. This first case involves a case that wasn't ever an investigation, and the second case we'll talk about initiated as a report of animal neglect. This first case is about an older gentleman named Tom and his best friend, Snowball the cat, that you see here. Tom and Snowball enjoy spending sunny days out in the yard together, soaking up the sun, but otherwise, Snowball is an indoor cat with Tom. And one day, in a freak accident, Snowball was hit by a car. And miraculously, the person who hit Snowball actually drove Tom and Snowball to the emergency clinic for the initial exam and paid for the initial exam because Tom did not have the money or the means to do either of those things. And this is an example, like Linda said, of the community being the first responder and making a difference in access to services, changing the route that this situation could have gone. If that person hadn't stopped, kept going, Tom would have been there with no transportation for his severely injured cat. But this person stepped up and helped provide access to services in that moment. At that initial exam, Snowball was diagnosed with a broken pelvis, and Tom was given two options. He was referred to specialists for treatment or to the Humane Society for humane euthanasia. Tom didn't even have the money to afford the initial exam, so of course he couldn't afford treatment by a specialist. So he ended up at the Humane Society with Snowball. After the initial assessment by the Humane Society, they realized that that cat didn't need to be euthanized, and they offered to Tom that if he would surrender ownership, they could take Snowball in and treat his injuries. So Tom opted to surrender ownership of his best friend in order to save his life. And when I think about being put in that situation, how difficult and also how easy that decision would be, but for Tom to have to make that decision is heartbreaking. Snowball ended up being treated with cage rest and pain medication by the Humane Society. He didn't even actually end up needing a specialist. And during Snowball's recovery at the Humane Society, Tom took the bus every week to bring baked goods to the medical team at the Humane Society, and he wrote them handwritten letters saying how much he loved Snowball, how much he appreciated what they were doing for Snowball, and that he would sell everything he owned in order to pay back what was owed for Snowball's care. Anyone in the audience with a companion animal knows the desperation that Tom must have felt during those weeks. This is a video of the manager of the medical department at the Humane Society at the time talking about how Snowball's case ended up.
Intended for Snowball and Tom to be reunited, because that's just not what we're able to do there. But Tom had been coming so much, I said, you know what, Tom, do you want to go see Snowball? Do you want to see how Snowball's doing? Of course he did. Of course he did. So we're able to bring Snowball out, meet with Tom a little bit, and Snowball was like a new cat. You know, the time before, it was like, we just thought the cat was so doped up. Obviously, the cat was sedated. This is just, you know. But when he saw Tom, it was like a whole new cat. No amount of pain meds could have created the change in this cat that seeing Tom was able to do. He stood up, he walked around, he started purring and headbutting Tom. Obviously, we had to return that cat to Tom.
You can see here that the bond was so clear and so evident that Snowball had to be returned to Tom, and there was no better home for Snowball, even though Tom struggled in this emergency scenario with how to provide care to Snowball. There is no question that he would have done anything he could have to help pay for that cat's treatment. And like I said earlier, Snowball's case never became an investigation, but it's because of these community players that stepped up and helped Tom and provide him this access to services throughout this situation. But it very easily could have gone another direction without that assistance or those resources. This next case, it started out as a report of animal neglect or suspected animal neglect. The report said that there was a dog that was thin and had something wrong with his mouth, and that the owner was struggling to care for the dog. So the officer responded to this report to look into it, and he met with the owner and noted that she was challenged with mental illness. He learned that this dog, Bubba, was her companion, and it helped her navigate those challenges. Bubba made her feel safe, and Bubba was her buddy. It was determined that the dog had cancer, and that's why he was missing half of his tongue, but the tongue had healed and it was not infected. The dog had difficulty eating on his own, so the woman had been soaking the food in water and hand or syringe feeding him, but he was still a little bit thin because she was struggling to provide an adequate quantity of food on a regular basis due to finances and her mental illness challenges. So the officer provided the woman with a bag of dog food and said he would be back to check on the dog in a few weeks. For 5 months, the officer checked in on the woman, brought her dog food, and checked on the dog. One day, the dog's condition may have turned for the worst, and over the months, the woman had grown to trust the officer, so she allowed the officer to take the dog to be examined by a veterinarian, who determined that the dog's cancer had returned and it was advanced, and the veterinarian recommended euthanasia. The officer returned the dog to the woman, explained the situation, and told her that he would be back the next day to transport the dog to the euthanasia appointment after she had an opportunity to say goodbye to him. The officer the next day took the dog to the humane euthanasia appointment, and after the appointment, the officer returned to the woman's house to give her her dog's ashes back. This is an example of where a partnership with a veterinarian and a shelter helped facilitate a humane response to the situation, both for the animal involved and the human involved. It's the response that we are striving to see from law enforcement, and it's the response we have a duty to help promote and support in our communities. As Linda mentioned, with the budgets of law enforcement being reallocated to other programs, this type of response from law enforcement is likely too resource intensive to be feasible for some departments right now. But that's a good example of how law enforcement can lean on the community partners to help them approach a case in this manner, using animal control officers or a local humane society to check on the woman. Even Meals on Wheels could add dog food to the food that they're bringing her and check on the welfare of the dog, and when the time is right, be able to help facilitate that humane outcome for all involved.
So how and where should communities begin? All of us are coming at this with the goal to reduce animal pain and suffering, preserve the bond between humans and their animals, and make animal ownership accessible and not exclusive. When we talk about the community approach, we talk about organizations that interact with low-income families, becoming aware of the animals in the home and their conditions. We think about enforcement agencies being proactive about the education and compliance response option rather than jumping to criminal citation. And we think about veterinarians and the veterinarian community embracing what they're calling the spectrum of care, which includes vet care that is less resource dependent and still comes out or still results in a positive outcome for the animal and their owner. And the illustration on this slide is actually from a vet school, and it's a real great introduction to the fact that even though amazing technological advances have been made in veterinary medicine, and there are specialty clinics now for cancer, ophthalmology, cardiac care, there's still a great foundation of care that can be adopted as what we like to call Plan B for those individuals who can't afford the highest level of technology but still want a positive outcome for their pets. And so we're really excited by those advances in rethinking and adopting the idea of providing a spectrum of care and looking forward to how that might help individuals. The video that Emily showed you of our Humane Society clinic manager talking about Snowball's case was actually through a presentation that the Humane Society made to benefit the introduction of a low-cost subsidized community vet clinic so that owners of animals wouldn't have to choose between euthanasia or surrender of their pets. They could actually be treated and return home. The lessons that we learned and we shared with you today came to us over the course of years of animal cruelty investigations work. Instead of that work making us feel like judging people harshly or cruelly or making us jaded or full of negativity, what it actually did was fill us with hope for the future and thinking that we could actually work toward eliminating the occurrence of criminal neglect in many cases, while understanding that there's still going to be those cases always that deserve criminal citation. This doesn't replace the enforcement of the law when criminal neglect is identified, and that every case has unique factors at play. But we're excited to understand that the community can help preserve the bond between humans and animals, and we can think about a more humane approach to education and compliance for individuals and families who, for one or a variety of reasons, are facing struggles. There still aren't enough homes for companion animals and shelters. We want to work to keep animals in their homes while making food, supplies, and vet care and education accessible to families. The people working in law enforcement, in the veterinary community, and at nonprofits and human services are the heroes that are working at this cause. And they're setting expectations that are within reach for pet parents, and they're acknowledging the wins and losses. We hope this presentation has reaffirmed or introduced these ideas to you, and we look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ed and Emily and Linda, for that compelling presentation. Such emotional, the Tom and Snowball story was wonderful, so thank you. We are now turning to our live Q&A, so we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The first question that we have, I'd actually like all three of you to answer if you don't mind, and it comes from someone who works with low-income folks with obtaining resources for their companion animals in rural South Carolina. And the question is, what do you say to people who argue that if a person can't afford to have a companion animal, then they just shouldn't have one? What do you say to that type of question? And whoever would like to start. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, sure. I'll definitely jump in. I used to be that person. You know, it's 20 years in the industry. That is how I started with that mind thought. And I'm glad that I have been able to start to look at everything as an individual case. And I am so not that person anymore, but I talk to that person, actually multiple of those people almost every single day. The reason I went the route I did on my presentation was showing Dallas, because it's truly, it just shows it so much. What is somebody supposed to do in an area that big when there's literally not a place for them to go if you're not able to find a way to help meet them where they're at. This industry's tried for decades of taking animals away from poor people, adopting them out to people with more means. We haven't gotten any further doing that. If somebody wants to have a pet, they're going to find a way to go get another one. Me being in the shelter world for almost 2 decades, it's still less than 25% of pets are acquired from shelters. So that's 75% other mechanisms. And so I believe that we're actually fueling those sources of pet acquisition that most of us talk poorly about. When you're simply trying to, take them out and not have the shelter community, animal community be a part of that. They're going to get it from a backyard breeder, all other kinds of ways that many of us have actually spent a lot of our time not doing. So yes, there are going to be those cases that people purposely don't get their animal what they need. We the presentation, Linda and Emily really highlighted that well. In my experience, most people, if given the access, they will utilize the access. And I think that as an industry as a whole, when we can start assuming that people are good and they love their pets, start with that, you'll hit those very small percentage that actually don't and intended to do harm. But it's amazing how much support you'll get from within the community once they realize they can trust you, that you're not there to just enforce, you're there to actually help them get the resource. And anybody doesn't have a million stories of how during COVID, how pets have kept families together, and really been that component in these really difficult times we've been in for the last year and a half or so. So yeah, I'm not ashamed to say I used to be that person. I'm very judgmental. Oh, you shouldn't have a pet if you can't afford it. To once they really got into it and see, man, these are actually good people who love their animals. And it's night and day difference when you're able to fill that gap and get them the resource they need. Then they love their animals just as much as millionaires when they're able to have access to that care.
Thank you, Ed, and I really appreciate your honesty and saying that you were one of those people. I think it's important that as we progress. Linda, did you want to answer the question as well?
Yeah, I think I was right there with Ed early on. And I know that most of the folks who worked with me at the Humane Society felt the same way. If you can't afford an animal, you don't deserve to have one. And I saw a big change in that way of thinking when our Humane Society started an in-house, low-cost, subsidized spay-neuter program. And it didn't happen overnight, the staff would say things like, oh, they'll make the appointment, but they won't show up, even though it's free services. They're not going to appreciate what we're doing, and just on and on, kind of preconceived ideas about the people who would be taking advantage of the program. But when you're working outreach and when you're meeting these individuals and you're seeing these families and you're hearing these stories, it is those stories that really flip a switch for you. So if you're doing outreach or you're working in an agency that's trying to do some subsidized work and you're getting those kinds of messages sometimes it's from supporters and donors. So you have to try to flip their switch, and a way to do that would be through storytelling, encouraging them to volunteer, on the ground in the program and to meet some of these individuals. And, lastly, just to, like we all could do, is kind of imagine what it would be like for us with our companion animals if an emergency happened and we couldn't, for some reason, afford to provide care for them. And what would that feel like? Because it's no different for these people.
Yeah, thank you. And the storytelling is so important. The Tom and Snowball one is one I'm sure you use a lot. Emily, would you like to answer the question as well?
Yeah, those are both really good answers, and I would echo those sentiments. I think I would just add that the financial aspect of your relationship with your companion animal is one component of what can make you a good or bad caregiver to your animal. There's so much more to that relationship, and I think it needs to be seen not as the only thing that matters in the relationship with your companion animal, because some of the relationships between these animals that those people maybe are referring to and that human have such a strong bond, and you know, that definitely counts for a lot in the spectrum of what you're looking at.
Great, thank you. The next question, going back to the pyramid that Linda and Emily had in your presentation, you made real clear that you're separating between people who are intentionally neglecting their animals or knowingly neglecting their animals. Do you have any benchmarks that you look for when you're looking at cases to try to determine where people fall in that spectrum? What experience can you share with us in that regard?
Yeah, I can tell you that just like in any investigation or an investigation that starts with an interview, you know, one of the things that we always look for is, you know, where are you spending your money if not on your animal? You know, and so you can't help but pulling into a driveway, and if you see a brand new car and you go in and there's a big screen television and they have, you know, folks have the best of everything, and yet their pet is out in the backyard desperately ill or in need of care, that makes it pretty obvious where the priority lies. And so you know, that's an extreme example, but I think that we always have to look at the big picture and see, you know, is this person pulling from one area to try to do better here, or is it just a conscious decision to spend money elsewhere when the animal is in need, because the animal isn't going to ask for help. And so in some cases, it can be easy to look the other way.
They're great tips. Emily or Ed, did either of you want to address that question as well?
One of my slides talked about over 10,000 calls for lack of care. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I know we issued a total of 22,000 citations that year. And it was a very small fraction for that lack of care of the citation that was actually written. So part of in that knowing, again, you can live in South Dallas and say, yes, I want to get something for my animal. I don't know where to get it. I can't put my dog on a bus. I can't get, you know, I can't get up to North Dallas. So we would use the standard then of, okay, we're going to give you access points, or we've got some groups that will be able to help, and then we're going to do a follow-up. And that's one of the ways to measure that. Is there really an intent in there? And what are they going to do now that there is an access? Whether it's, hey, the SPCA is going to call you, you have to make an appointment, or here, Spay Neuter Network or Dallas Animal Services, there's multiple groups that are trying to meet people where they're at. And that's why we did not write anywhere close to 10,000 citations for lack of care. And that's not from us not enforcing when it needed to be done, but it's truly having to go in on the case by case. And then, all right, now you're identified and we are showing you what you need to do. If you still neglect to do that, boy, it's really hard for me not to have a case that you're not knowingly being neglectful, because you now have the information and weren't able to take advantage of it.
Great, thank you, Ed. Emily, did you want to respond as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think in my mind, there's two scenarios of neglect investigations. It's the kind like Ed was just talking about. You go out there, there's actions they could take if they had access to those resources. You provide those and you check in. And I think that's a huge part of animal cruelty casework. And it might be the reason why some agencies aren't able to or prioritize it, because it is resource intensive, and going back out and checking, it's not in most cases going out there and issuing a criminal citation first time. You're checking up on them, you're trying to do monitoring and compliance, like Ed was talking about. But I think in the cases I was talking about in the top part of that pyramid, it's the situation where that animal, they're suffering. It's a dire situation. There's been a clear, your duty as the animal responder on behalf of the animals to protect them is clear there. And I think the investigation still needs to happen, and that can happen in tandem with responding to what the animal needs in that moment when you respond. But I would just say that those are the smaller amount of cases versus going out to a location multiple times and trying to work through a situation and seeing how people respond to the resources you provide them.
Great, thank you, Emily. All three of you, those were wonderful tips. Continuing with the theme of lack of resources, this question relates to when the resources just don't exist. The problem that this person has run into is a shortage of veterinarians in general. This person is in an area where 80% of the population lives in one metro area, so those in rural areas just don't have access to veterinary care. And the question is, are you aware of any organizations that can send teams of vets in order to go to clinics to provide free or low-cost services? Any of you aware of anything like that or have heard solutions in that regard?
I know a lot are talking about this, and that is a great point. I think that the veterinarian shortage, which we've all known for years, and it's really, really highlighted now, and it's getting worse by the day, is really going to make even more of these situations. People who love their pet tremendously, and you're just going to see it from areas that were your traditional lower income areas up into where middle class isn't going to be able to afford veterinary care, and then even up through that spectrum because the cost it continues to increase. One of the reasons that one of those earlier slides, all the groups that I'm involved with and boards that I'm on is to be a part of these discussions. And I know that everybody is talking about it and trying to find, methods. When you get down to simple, like vaccines, Petco Foundation, which now Petco Love, is making a huge push. And I believe $1 million investment, I think initially trying to provide vaccines for the public who aren't able to afford public. That's kind of the first thing that jumped to my mind. Organizations like mine, one of the reasons that I left government work after many, many years in it to come over to nonprofit is we are trying to get we have good veterinary resources here and a little bit of additional bandwidth on top of our normal sheltering. And how can we get to those areas, not just southern Dallas, but there's a lot of rural areas, as you speak of, outside of Dallas proper, that as we've been trying to get ourselves around, they don't have anything either. So I could do a much bigger map that gets outside of the urban metro area, and it would be very, very similar. So again, Petco Love is the one that jumps to me. And again, there's a focus on vaccines, basic vaccines. Let's try to stop some of these preventable illnesses that we see down here in the South so much. And then hopefully there's other groups like mine that this is what we are paying a lot of attention to. Obviously I'm here in the North Texas area. But if you know of any groups that are looking for veterinary care, we're learning that some aren't able to give basic stuff, that if I can have a vet go for 4 hours a week, could make a huge difference in certain areas.
Thank you, Ed, for those experiences. Sounds like this is a common one. Linda or Emily, did either or both of you care to weigh in on that question?
Well, I think a place to start, whether it's to check to see if there are any resources that could come to this individual or this community, or to start having the conversation about the need, would be with the animal shelters and animal control agencies that serve the area and the state. If there is a university with a veterinary school in that state or a neighboring state, they often will get behind, community efforts for spay neuter with their with students. And I think the state veterinary medical association might be interested to know as well, and or may be able to provide some outlets or some resources.
Great, thank you. Emily, did you want to respond?
Yeah, that's a difficult situation and a really good question. I would just add that one thing that came out of the pandemic was virtual veterinary care of sorts. And so it might be a way to, assess animals that need looked at and then send more efficient use of resources, send a tech or one veterinarian out there to administer care on one day, but you are already knowing what's needed or something to that effect, using those creative means that we've had to use over this past year and a half.
Thank you. Great suggestions. All of your presentations related to neglect that was already in progress. The question is, if you had to pick one thing that as communities we could be doing to prevent the neglect from starting in the first place when it relates to a lack of access to care, what would it be? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
It's just kind of generic, but it's communication. As you know, in our world, we think it's super loud and everybody knows what we're doing. We're on social media, we're doing press releases, you get in front of the camera whenever you can. Nothing beats getting out into the areas and talking to people. And it's so much better when you're able to talk with somebody and there's no problem. You're not there for a loose dog. You're not there for a bite. You're not there for a lack of care call. You're simply there saying, hey, I'm with Animal Services, Humane Society, nonprofit group, whatever, just saying hi and talking with people. Is there anything that you need? People love to be heard. And this world has gotten very difficult with distancing. I think we took a step back. We had to with the pandemic, but being able to simply communicate and get out, because it hit me. We put so much into our marketing at Dallas Animal Services, and it hit us that the people that need us the most aren't watching Facebook, and certainly not watching Dallas Animal Services Facebook. They're the ones that are seeing my officers drive up and down the road. And again, usually it's responding to a situation. So I had put in place, it wasn't one of the official requirements, but they were supposed to get in the habit of waving at everybody they saw when they were out, because they were the front line of defense. And it's much better when they saw you being friendly, just waving by at a couple people sitting on the porch, as opposed to knocking on their door because you received a complaint about something. So I know that's a little generic and high level, but just the more you're able to communicate with people when there's not a situation happening, you have a better chance of them knowing about you and at least giving you a call that might help prevent a situation from happening.
Wonderful. That's great advice, Ed. So communication is the answer from Ed. Emily or Linda, did you want to pick? I know it's hard to pick one thing.
I could say, to kind of piggyback with Ed about communication, anyone who could be a resource should know how to tell people where to get help. And so that includes not only animal control or enforcement agencies, but, the elementary school social workers or the resource officers at the school, the cable guy, the postmaster, anyone who is going by houses, seeing animals and interacting with people. If they know who you are and where you're located, if you have an organization that's providing subsidized or low-income help, then the resources are going to be in these people's hands. And one of the stories that we told about the little dog, that individual had no idea where to go. He didn't have the internet. He didn't have the technology that we use now to find help. So word of mouth is still really important in some of these communities, and working together, all of the social services and all of the human services to include animals in their communication is going to go a long way, I think.
Thank you, Linda. And Emily, for you, what would your answer be?
I would just say any endeavor that seeks to provide basic care for a companion animal. I think all of these families and individuals want to provide that for their animals, but they're prevented from doing so until there's an urgent need, medical need. And I think the more that you can provide those, vaccines or food banks or anything like that, then you're also building that relationship so that when something does take a turn, they have that relationship to turn to and ask for help or seek help. And on the other hand, those people are invested in those families now, and they can look to their network of people to try to find help in that particular situation. It's just making those different connections are really important.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think that we have concluded the question and answer session. Thank you all for your engaging questions, for the wonderful presentations, Ed and Emily and Linda. Thank you.